thank everyone for attending tonight's event that's being put on by the Niagara Falls Anti-Racism Committee. I would like to start the event by acknowledging that Niagara region of Ontario is located on the traditional shared territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Chunatone peoples. The Chunatone people have called these lands home for thousands of years, and more recently, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee have been sharing the land as one dish, one spoon treaty territory. Tonight, we are recording the presentation portion of this event in hopes to share it on the YouTube channel in the coming days. We will not post the discussion portion of the event to ensure that all attending has a safe space and that we respect everyone's privacy. So I'd like to begin by introducing the head chair of the Anti-Racism Committee, Ms. Sherry Darling.
Thank you. I'm very excited about tonight's event. The Niagara Falls Anti-Racism Committee is a committee of the Niagara Falls Council that first met in March of 2021. We've been meeting with representatives of various communities and have struck out on various initiatives in the past year. Our vision for the committee is that we will understand the current racial issues of all culturally diverse communities and develop initiatives to bring sustainable change in our community. This is our first public event, and this really does match our vision. I would like to acknowledge the members of the committee, and if you are here, please stand if you can do so. Seema Abbasi, Don Brown, Katie Kumar, Janet Madume, Angel Tran, our City Council Rep, Lori Lococo, and our Mayor's Youth Advisory Council Rep, Pranshu Patel. Here. Thank you for all the work you've done this far for this important work we are doing. The discussion tonight came about a conversation we had at a committee meeting following the tragedy in Buffalo, which came very close to home for myself. I did have a distant relative that did perish in that event. We had a committee meeting. One of the things that came about to me was I have done all this work with Justice for Black Lives, as many of you know, and I really thought there was just one area which I had completely ignored, and it was I had never done the work to find out how these kids are getting radicalized and what are they reading, where are they going to see this, and why don't we educate ourselves on how they're stealing our babies, because this is what they're doing. Your kids are just as much at risk as my black son. Your white children are at risk of being taken by these people and radicalized, and you don't want to look up on TV and wonder where you missed the mark or how you didn't see it. So this is the beginning of starting to have these difficult conversations, and that's how this night came about. We wanted to, maybe have Dr. Perry come in and just speak to the committee, and we thought we should make this a public thing so that anybody who wants to learn about this, and I don't know about you guys, but I really want to know what is being said. I know we all heard in the Buffalo shooting that this young man, what was it, the white replacement theory? I didn't know anything about that until I heard it on the television, and this is what promoted him, this is what he was reading, this is where he got his information. And I think when it comes to this extreme level of hate, we have to be just as extreme at resisting and combating it. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Barbara Perry. We met with Dr. Perry and saw what her background and research entailed. We knew this was the right person to bring in and provide us with a better understanding of this topic. Barbara Perry is a professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University and the director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. She also holds a UNESCO Chair in Hate Studies, a field in which she has written 2 or 3 books. Am I correct? Yeah.
12 or 13.
Oh, okay. My bad. She is currently working in the areas of anti-Muslim violence, anti-Semitic hate crime, and the community impacts of hate crime and right-wing extremism in Canada. She is regularly called upon by policymakers, practitioners, and local and national international media as experts on hate as an expert on hate crime and right-wing extremism. At this time, I am very pleased to announce and welcome her to Niagara Falls to present this presentation as Dr. Barbara Perry.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you. I'm gonna wander around. I am a wanderer. On. There we go. There's a blue light, so that must mean it's on. Thank you so much for this. I was just saying before we started, I'm really nervous. This is the first live presentation I've done in 2.5 years. So, it actually feels good. There's energy here. Yeah, I'm saying also that the nice thing about doing things online is that you can pack a lot into a week. Because I don't have to travel from Niagara to Ottawa and wherever in between to do the presentations. I can just hop online. So I was probably doing half a dozen or so presentations a week during COVID lockdowns. But it is really good to be with people and have actual eye contact and maybe some conversation later. So I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's so timely to start this conversation. I really appreciate that the committee is doing so. Maybe I'll start with, you mentioned the Great Replacement. Maybe I'll just start with that and sort of unpacking that a little bit before we move on, because that really is something that we've heard a lot about since Buffalo. But do you remember the first time you heard about this? There was a period, an episode previous.
Back in the 80s, 90s with the skinhead riots, I remember hearing about it then.
Yeah.
When I was in high school.
Yep, and they were calling it something different then, right? They were calling, they talked a little bit about replacement, but they also talked about white genocide and the extermination of the white race, that sort of thing. Someone else had a hand up.
Yeah, Anders Breivik.
Yeah, Anders Breivik, and then after him, the shooter in Christchurch. Both of them referenced the Great Replacement. So this is not a new theory, a new perspective. It's a new label in some respects. And is certainly given great currency by the contemporary movement, far-right movement. But it really is what it says on the tin, right? There is this theory, this conspiracy theory, that there is some international cabal whose goal is to replace the white, especially Christian, race with something else. Whether it is, if we think back to the 80s in particular, there was more concern there about African immigration. Now the concern is with Middle Eastern and especially Muslim immigration into Canada. So a fear that somehow white Christians and white Christian values are going to be replaced by something else. And that this is planned and purposeful. It's not just something that's happening organically. So it is a conspiracy theory. Like so many of the other narratives that we're hearing, especially over the last couple of years, since QAnon and certainly under COVID as well. So I thank you for reminding me to talk about that and sort of unpack that. What I'm going to talk about, a lot of things I'm going to talk about tonight, but really some context. Why are we seeing such a surge in hate and right-wing extremism in recent years? And sort of finishing then with a conversation about what you can do individually and what you can expect your municipality and the community to do as well. And then followed up by my new friends here, who will talk about what your local law enforcement are doing in this space. Yeah. Okay. That always gets a bit of a rise. Just want to think about what are some of the flashpoints? What are some of the things that are motivating this rise in right-wing extremism? As I'll suggest in the next, I think it's the next slide, we're really seeing a normalization of hate, an expansion, a mainstreaming of hateful ideas and ideologies and narratives that 5 years ago even, people would have tried to silence, to deflect. Right? But they've come very much into the mainstream, into political discourse, and a lot of that started with Trump. Now, we had our own problems already in Canada during the end of the last Conservative administration. There was a lot of anti-immigrant and a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment that we really hadn't seen at the federal level prior to that. So we had that. We've had the Islamophobic rhetoric in Quebec. Specifically, we've had anti-gay, anti-indigenous sentiment amongst party leaders in Western Canada as well. So not necessarily that Trump was introducing anything new, but he was so bald-faced about it and so blatant about it that it gave permission to hate. It gave permission to hate mongers, whether they were individual armchair hate mongers or whether they were part of an organized group. And so we really saw that percolating throughout the society in the US and percolating across the border as well, because we're really talking about social media borders here. And they are porous, right? There are no borders. We heard the same tweets, we heard the same social media feeds. So that really galvanized the movement in Canada as well as in the US. And of course he continued it through his administration, he continues it now while he's out of office. One of the other things that maybe is a distant memory now, but 3 or 4 years ago, remember there was, all of this concern about the refugee crisis as it was constructed. Well, yeah, absolutely, it was a crisis for the people who were fleeing, war-torn countries or fleeing persecution, but it was constructed by the far right as a crisis to Canada, part of that great replacement, right? That they were coming here to take our place, our jobs, our welfare system, right, to impose an alternative set of values. So there was real resistance there. You remember some of the border patrols that were being set up by far-right activists, right, who thought that border patrol agents were not doing their job, and so they had to be there to turn people back through intimidation. So we saw that galvanizing the movement. The last couple of years, and we'll see some of the data as well, the last couple of years what we've seen is quite a dramatic increase in anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violence and activism as well. And that's reactionary violence, right? That's a response to people stepping outside of what is thought to be their appropriate place, right? So the visibility and the vocal nature of the Black Lives Matter movement and the reactions to the George Floyd murder and all of the other lives taken by law enforcement. Okay? So it's a reaction against that activism, as is anti-Indigenous violence a reaction to the land defenders, especially in Western Canada, although we saw it on the East Coast around fisheries. And remember Burt Church years ago, around lobster fisheries in particular. So we're also seeing that kind of backlash. And of course COVID. Oh my gosh, COVID has been just a boon for the far right in terms of providing fodder for their conspiracy theories. You remember, especially very early on, the anti-Asian sentiment, the anti-Asian narratives, and the anti-Asian violence that has continued, right? That somehow they were purposefully responsible. Asian communities were purposely responsible for COVID. Not just bringing COVID, but creating it and letting it loose. Or it was a Jewish plot to take over the world, to facilitate the use of the vaccine, which of course we all know has implants, right? So they control our behavior. So say no to that vax just in case. But so many pieces during COVID. The anti-statism, never seen this level of anti-state activism, hostility, anger, right, that we're seeing now. Very unconstructive, right? It's fine to be, resistant to, opposing government policy. This is completely unconstructive oppositions. Inflamed and informed by those conspiracy theories. Okay. So I said refer to this notion of normalizing hate, and here are some of the examples of public statements that have been made by politicians. Trump, obviously, ongoing during his run-up to the leadership of the Republican Party, his run-up to his surprising and terrifying win in 2016, and then continuing throughout that administration. But of course, as I said, right, we've had some of our own problems in the Canadian context. Legault, this one is probably one of the most disturbing. This was on the anniversary of the Quebec City murders, when he could say there's no Islamophobia in Quebec. I think he's not paying very close attention. So that denial, that dismissal, right, of a very serious problem that affects individuals and communities is an affront to the community. Okay? And then Sloan, who was, bounced from the Conservative caucus before the last election, I mean, he had many public statements that, were offensive and harmful and damaging and dangerous. This one revolving around really pedophilia, right? The implication here, banning conversion therapy will legalize child abuse. So he was essentially saying that if we don't cure the gays, right, they're going to attack our children. Right? So feeding into those stereotypes as well. So it's not just around race, it's not just around religion, it's around gender as well. And I think we're going to see the escalation of the gender wars in the aftermath of the horrific decision by the Supreme Court this past week. Because already they're signaling, we come after the women's rights, we're coming after gay rights next, right? We're coming after trans rights next as well. So more to come. So normalizing hate. And a couple of others here, right? And Faith Goldie, you might remember from the last mayoral election in Toronto, who ran on an explicitly racist far-right platform. She has long been sort of, pardon the pun, the golden child of the far-right movement, because she's young and she's attractive and she's appealing. So she was very much exploited by the movement to bring people to the cause. She garnered about 20,000 votes in Toronto, the most diverse city in the country. In that election, there were about 40,000 votes in total cast for explicitly far-right candidates in Toronto. And of course, Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada. Need not say more. Keep in mind, very early on, folks flooded to that party as soon as he created it. Far-right activists, far-right ideologues flooded to his party. He tried to distance himself, not very hard, and was not very successful at that. And of course, found a whole new raison d'etre, whole new cadre of support during COVID, and especially during the freedom convoys as well. So what we're talking about here, really, as I said, is the normalization of hate. Creating an environment where it's acceptable, it's okay, you have permission to express those sentiments that, maybe we're somewhere deep inside, or perhaps maybe we're given voice by some of those folks we've referred to. So we're seeing this pop up in a number of different ways. So looking here at some recent public opinion polls, this really does suggest that folks recognize the extent to which it's okay to express those sentiments. 33% feel freer to publicly express those negative views. 25 and 15% feel that prejudice against Muslims and anti-Semitism has become more acceptable. So recognizing that. 46% oppose immigration. Most concerning, 37% feel that immigration is a threat to white Canadians. Taken right out of the playbook of the far right. Really terrifying when that enters the mainstream, that kind of sentiment. Again, the replacement theory, right? So what are we seeing? So this is really what we have begun to characterize, sorry about that, as the landscape of the far right. So interestingly, we conducted what was the first study, comprehensive national study of the far right, published that report in 2015. At that point, this is what we were really focusing on. Skinheads, white supremacists, neo-Nazis. Your very traditional, jack-booted, Doc Marten-booted, black-clad thugs, essentially. Not much to distinguish them in many respects. I mean, they were horrifically racist, horrifically anti-Semitic, misogynistic. I mean, you name it. It was part of their philosophy. I guess the difference was really the core focus. So for white supremacists, it was race. For neo-Nazis, race, but also anti-Semitism was very significant to them. Skinheads, they just wanted to kick the shit out of people. They didn't really care who it was. So this is, I guess the skinheads are probably the, sort of the storm troops, right? They were the most aggressive element. So that was 2015. This is what we're seeing now, and there are probably a couple I'm missing. This is not necessarily an exhaustive categorization. We're still unpacking this in the midst, at the tail end, an updated study of the same sort. So now we have a pillar that is explicitly anti-Muslim, And anti-immigrant often, right? If you think back to what I was mentioning early on, right? That connection often between fear of immigration and why, because it's Muslim immigration they're most concerned about. The alt-right is something, of course, you heard a lot about during the Trump era. And, you know, in some respects, there's not much that's alternative about the alt-right. Right? That same thread of white nationalism, white supremacy, very much a part of their narrative. What is alternative about them? I mean, the alt from their perspective was about, they were an alternative to traditional conservatism in the West broadly, not just Canada and the US. That they felt like contemporary conservatives had sold out, that they had lost their true conservative ideals, they were too inclusive. Right? And so it was sort of almost a return to those older ideals. The other thing that's alternative about them is their presentation of self, right? They're not in the black leather that we associate with the skinheads or with the neo-Nazis. They're in, what a few decades ago, my day, we would have called preppy. Right, with the polo shirts and all of that, or even the suits and ties. If you think about some of the originators, Richard Spencer and Bannon, some Trump sycophants, they represent themselves, they present themselves as much more professional. They often were professional or are professional, and much more well-spoken, much more articulate, often better educated as well, which is the scary thing, right? And therefore, more palatable, easier to digest, if you will. We also have, and keep in mind, there's a lot of overlap between these are sort of artificial divisions in some respects, a lot of overlap. Many of them are anti-immigrant, many of them are white supremacist. What's interesting that we've included the manosphere here. So that is a misogynistic element of the movement. And that's really important to keep in mind. The far-right movement, the white supremacist movement, has always been misogynistic at core. Gender is as important as race in many respects, because you can't maintain the purity of the white race without controlling our women. Hence, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So it is very much a part of that movement as well. But there is, an explicitly an obvious misogynistic element now. If you think about the incel, for example. Patriots and militia, very worrying, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment. So these are the defenders, great defenders of the country and the country's values. We associate, I think, with militia with the U.S. And it is a relatively recent phenomenon in the Canadian context. This is unusual for us. You see here I've also put conspiracy theorists and anti-authority activists in italics, because conspiracy theorists and anti-authority activists span the political spectrum, left, right, center, apolitical. But there are very distinct right-wing conspiracy theorists and anti-authority conspiracy theorists. And this is what was really on display during the Freedom Convoys, and perhaps will be again on July 1st. And lone actors, many of the mass murders that we've seen across the globe, but in Canada specifically, have been lone actors. And I put that in quotation marks because they act alone, but they're not alone. Right? They're mobilized by what they're consuming online. They are part of a community. They are part of that far-right community. Right? They just aren't active adherents, right? They don't affiliate with a particular group. They haven't conspired with anyone to commit those acts. But nonetheless, they're not acting in a vacuum by any stretch. So this is sort of the landscape. And as I say, I think, there's probably a couple we've missed it. Oh, accelerations, I didn't talk about them. That's something we started to hear more of in Canada, I think. Well, two occasions. One was, do you remember hearing about Patrick Matthews a few years back in Manitoba? He was an Army reservist, and he was found to have been recruiting actively for the base, which is an accelerationist group. Accelerationist, it is what it says on the tin. Their intent is to accelerate what they see as an inevitable civil war. Whether that is the traditional, if we think back to the skinheads, white supremacists, traditional racial holy war, or RAHOA, or an all-out civil war, depends on the individual, depends on the group. but their intent is to disrupt. So many applauded the events of January 6th in the US, for example, seeing that as the beginning of the next civil war in the US, which it might well have been, sort of the first shot across the bow, if you will. And they're very dangerous. They and the Patriots and militia are, I think, the most dangerous, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. What else are we seeing? So signs of hate. We're seeing some of these kinds of posters immediately after the Trump election. They started to show up in cities and small communities, large and small, across the country immediately after the Trump election. So did these, but we saw them, there was a resurgence of these sorts of anti-Asian posters in particular after the beginning of COVID, in the midst of all the anti-Asian narratives, if you will. So these are, this is very old-fashioned. This is a very traditional way of spreading the word, right? These are just on, sometimes under windshields, windshield wipers, sometimes on, posted on hydro poles or on the sides of buildings. So very traditional methodology there. We're seeing a dramatic growth in the numbers of far-right groups. So this is the map from 2015. So this was just over 100 active groups. We're just putting together the map for the subsequent study, where we have identified now over 300 active groups. Now, it's a moving target. It's really hard to count because they morph, they break. So think about the Proud Boys, right? Who are so much in the news. They were designated as a terrorist entity. So it's illegal to support or contribute to the Proud Boys. Well, they just recreated themselves in another form. And that's what often happens. So we've had now, I think 7? Is it 7 groups? Far-right groups designated as terrorist entities. And the base and Atomwaffen, they're still active. They don't give a shit. They don't care at all about that designation. In fact, they wear it as a badge of honor. So they're still active. Proud Boys, they dissolved and popped up as something else. And that will happen, right, as pressure is put on particular groups. Those who are not that committed will walk away, but the most hard resolved folks will stay in the movement and recreate it as something else. And we'll talk about what that looks like. What that growth looks like in a moment. So here's another indicator of that normalization of hate. And this is the hate crime, police reported hate crime data. Look at this increase over time. So relatively level over here, and some increases, decreases, not enough to really pay much attention to. Then in 2017, dramatic increase, 47% increase. What happened? Oh yeah, wait a minute, Trump. It was 2016 to 2017, that really dramatic increase, in that response that I talked about earlier on. Saw a bit of a decrease the following year, a bit of another uptick. And then 2020, look at this, another 37% increase. So we're at a historic high for police reported hate crime. Now, some of that has to do with changes in the way that communities are reporting, the way that police are recording, but it's reflecting more than that. It's reflecting a real change in the numbers, the impact, the threat to communities. And as I mentioned, so if we look here, what we were seeing in 2016 and 2017 was an increase in anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic hate crime. And here what we were seeing is an increase in anti-Asian, anti-Black, and anti-Indigenous hate crime in 2020. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see another increase in 2021, or at least a plateau. It's not going to go down very much, I don't think. So yeah, pretty dramatic. I mean, if we'd seen an increase like this, 47 or 37% in any other category of crime, we'd have called a national inquiry to sort out what's going on, and rightfully so. Here, not so much. So I just thought I'd share this with you to see where you live. Now you're below the Canadian average, so well done on you. But, I mean, if we look at where the concentrations are, let's put the Hamilton, we'll start with Toronto, Hamilton, Tri-Cities, London, and let's say Catherine's, Niagara. So, and this is something that corresponds to what we're seeing with far-right groups, is a real concentration in southern and western Ontario. And that has been the case for decades. These are often the birthplaces of, I think, coming to the public attention 2015 or so. And you know, not something to be proud of, but the founder was Canadian. Oddly enough, was with left-wing Vice, then moved to the US and created the Proud Boys. How bizarre. But here's some of the mottos, if you will, or the values, and we love our guns. That's something we'll come back to, so remember that. So a lot of new groups, and many of those that we've identified in our count are actually new groups. And these can be as small as a couple of people, 3 people, half a dozen. But some of them can be much larger than that, right? In the dozens. So there's a group called Lamut out of Quebec that very early on claimed to have 40,000 members, most online. Now, that was probably an exaggeration, but they probably did have in the tens of thousands. How do we count that? It's really hard to count that. You can count it by shares, you know, if you're looking at their social media channels, can you look at shares, likes, you know, subscriptions, all of those sorts of things. I mean, if you look at some of these, it's probably a lot of people like me who are just dropping in to see what they're talking about. But nonetheless, that is one way to count. And we're seeing, obviously, increased activity on these sites. We're also seeing, one of the things is not just more numbers in terms of groups, but individuals as well. Something that law enforcement has described to us as the atomization of the movement. That is, that there are a lot of individuals, those lone actors, who are being drawn into the movement, being drawn to the online presence and narratives and stories, but not necessarily affiliating with a particular group. So these are floaters, right, who are consuming all of that, taking it away, but not necessarily, you know, sort of engaging with the material, engaging with any of those groups. Just taking that messaging away, and often cherry picking, taking little bits from multiple groups and multiple social media platforms to suit their own needs and to, you know, to craft their own answers to their anxieties. I talked about the accelerationist. That is a new part of the movement, something that we've really only seen, and seen in Canada in particular. I think, you know, when Matthews emerged, gosh, I think it was about 5 years ago now, that was really the warning signal for us that the base in Adam-Waffern were crossing the border. These are American-based groups. They're horribly violent, horribly aggressive in their narratives, and have no qualms about the need to arm themselves, not just defensively, but offensively as well, right, to, again, accelerate that civil war. So you can see here, right, the homage they're paying to Hitler and the Third Reich. And even in this imagery here. We're seeing interesting demographic shifts in the far right. If we think back to that typology that I shared with you, so many of the skinheads and the neo-Nazis, I mean, we think of them and we think, you know, young. Right, 18 to 24, maybe some people stay in the movement longer, especially if they have a leadership role, because that's status for them. That's some kind of badge to wear. We've been seeing a really significant shift there. That element hasn't gone away by any stretch. We still see an awful lot of young people being brought into the movement, but we're also seeing a lot of middle-aged and older people being drawn into the movement, especially during COVID, drawn in through those conspiracy theories. As a gateway narrative, if you will, and being pulled in deeper and deeper. And that's a lot of what happened around the convoy, right? That people who are, you know, would never consider themselves part of a far-right movement or group, you know, you spend 3 weeks with bullhorns in your ear, you know, shouting those kinds of narratives, you're going to be inculcated, if you will, indoctrinated. So we are seeing more middle-aged and older people, educated and well-employed, right? If we think back again to the alt-right, these were professionals. Think about the events of January 6th. Doctors, lawyers, accountants, law enforcement, military, you know, professionals, well-educated people. People who you would think would be able to think critically and reflexively about their situation. And that's a real challenge, right, in terms of interventions. If we're talking about youth, well, you know, we can get them through the schools, we can get them through youth groups and communities. How do you get to adults? Right? So this is where I think labor movement, for example, becomes really important in terms of action in the workplace, conversations in the workplace. Real challenge, I think, confronting us here. One of the other trends we're seeing is this coalition building. Again, the convoys were a really good example of that. So when we were doing the first study, there was an awful lot of competition between groups. They didn't want to work together because they were all jockeying for position to be the most radical, the most offensive, right? The most damaging, the most, to be honest, macho, right? Toxic masculinity at its worst here. Now we're seeing, and we're starting to see this 2015, think about many of those rallies and demonstrations that the far right were holding in 2017, 2018. You had these kinds of coalitions coming together, multiple groups coming together, strategizing online, communicating regularly. Again, we saw that with the convoys, right? Very clear example of the extent to which groups are now working together to a common aim rather than competing for space, competing for the loudspeaker, if you will. And that's dangerous, right? It's a show of solidarity. It increases their sense of strength and oneness, but it also, I think, is threatening to audiences as well, right? It shows the audiences the strength that they have in numbers. Excuse me. And this is the thing that's worrying, right? We're seeing an increasing, it's really interesting, at the end of our 2015 report, I mean, there was very little mention of guns. We did a subsequent report on the anti-authority movement, and we started to see there some elements of a group called the 3 Percenters, which is a militia group. And I think just a little bit in Quebec, maybe a little bit in Alberta. But since then, this militia/patriot movement has really grown quite dramatically. So 3 Percenters is probably the epitome of that. 3 Percenters is actually, it was named after the American group, and it's a reference to, 3% of the population fought against the crown in the Revolutionary War. So it comes back, it's sort of cloaked in the Second Amendment conversations, all of that. We see that come up in the Canadian context. I don't think we've ever seen excuse me, so much emphasis on a guns rights narrative as we're seeing now. Think back even to the Proud Boys, who said we love our guns. Right? We're seeing images like this. We're seeing images of 3 Percenters, other militia groups, engaging in paramilitary training out in the woods with stacks of semi-automatic weapons, assault-style weapons. Right? So they're active. The other worrying thing, so they're armed. The other worrying thing is that they are drawing on former and active military and law enforcement personnel. Okay. The assumption being that they can bring the skills that are needed to strategize, the skills that are needed to ensure that they can mount a defensive, if not offensive, operation. Okay, so they're armed, they're trained, and they're xenophobic and hateful. Really dangerous combination. So these are the sorts of groups I think we really need to pay attention to. The accelerationists I would put in that same space. Again, Patrick Matthews, classic example. We're actually working now with D&D on a study looking at the nexus between the far right and the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think we're going to see some worrying trends there. Excuse me. Sorry, just a sip here. So, what's my time like? Isn't paying attention. Okay. And how long do I have?
As long as you can.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Now, just a quick question, perhaps it could help not paint with a broad brush, because of obviously right-wing extremism is a deep concern. How do you stratify the difference between the right and the far right?
I'm just going to stop you right there. We're actually going to have questions when she's done.
Sure.
Yeah.
Of course, thank you.
Hold that one.
Yeah.
It's a really important question. Yeah. And it's a sliding scale because the center has shifted so dramatically in recent years. So I want to talk a little bit about recruitment strategies. And I think we tend to think this is all happening online now, and there certainly is an awful lot. But I think we can't dismiss the fact that there's still a lot of face-to-face in-person recruitment going on within the movement. And some of that very traditional form of recruitment as well that I was referring to earlier on, the flyers, the leaflets, the posters, the protests, and the demonstrations, right? They're not just an opportunity for them to vent their anger and their anxiety and their grievances. These are also recruitment opportunities for them. They certainly saw the convoys as a recruitment opportunity as well, a chance to have, those thousands of people, right, listening to their tales, right, their explanations for what has gone wrong, okay? So they use them as very public platforms for bringing people into the movement. Other forms of face-to-face, a lot of it is, very informal stuff in bars that they frequent, right, where they strike up a conversation with someone, right? Maybe they're watching the hockey game. Why did they let that black guy play? Why did they let that Indian guy play? Right? So they start those, what we don't think are subtle, but they think are subtle conversations in a bar, watching a game, watching an advertisement, watching a TV show, and lure them in. It's a process, right? And it's not linear by any stretch. You can bring someone in. It's like fishing, I guess, right? You can reel someone in and let some line out. Oh, that one got away, right? Jump the hook. So important to keep that in mind because that means there are multiple points of intervention, right, for that recruitment. So they subtly and slowly will draw people into those narratives. If it starts in a bar, you might then graduate up the way to some of the other events and activities that the groups might be engaged with. Mixed martial arts has become very popular. There were folks out west that were referring to it when we were doing the first study. We're hearing much more of that now. And that makes sense, right? Again, think about what a masculinist activity this is. Mixed martial arts is a perfect environment for that. Peer-to-peer, so friends, trying to draw friends in, family members even, trying to draw other family members in. And we're seeing very active recruiting at schools, public schools even, high schools, as well as colleges and universities across the campus, or across the country. And that can be through the posters, through the peer-to-peer, but also by bringing in some of those speakers who are very controversial, but share some of the same narratives as some of these far-right actors. Excuse me. And then, of course, there is the online. And there are so many venues online in which people can be drawn into the movement. The social media presence. So, we know the social media giants aren't doing what they could be doing to limit hate speech, misinformation, disinformation. So there's still, even in the very mainstream social media platforms, there's still a lot of opportunity for people to be brought in there. Even the fringe, right? So they've moved out of the mainstream, if they've been deplatformed, they've created venues that have no filters, right? Who have no content moderation. And these have become very popular for the movement and very popular for people, looking for those answers to hard questions. Specialized apps, the websites and forums. Stormfront, for example, was started in the 80s, and it's still going. It's the longest lived and potentially one of the largest platforms, and it's international. There's a Canadian page, right? There's a dating page. There's a home page, right? Things, how to take care of your home sort of thing. There's a women's page. There's a children's page, right? So all these forums for different audiences, all within Stormfront, all far right. That dating page is scary. The music, of course, and the music, it's really interesting because I think when we think about white power music, we think of headbanging, music, and that's a lot of it. But there are dozens of genres to be found in the white power music. Country and Western is as popular as the metal music. So racist, if you think back to the origins of country music, a lot of it was pretty racist and misogynistic. So it's not that much of a stretch. But yeah, some of it is, Johnny Rebel is the big one. He's long dead, but he keeps new covers of his music, and his music stays alive. horrifically misogynistic, explicitly racist, kill the N, kill the N, kill the N. So just horrible, horrible stuff. But appealing to some people. There's even folk music, so very gentle ways to kill people. Yeah, just terrifying. And then the gaming. The gaming is the place right now. Not just for youth, for adults as well, right? Because a lot of adults, especially during COVID, spend a lot of time in these gaming apps. And it's not so much the games, although there's ethnic cleansing, that's an old game now where there's extra points for black people and Jews and cops as well. And it itself is racist. There are a lot of games that are misogynistic. But it's more than the games, it's the ancillaries, right? The supplements, the chat rooms that are associated with it. That's how people are brought in to the movement. And so just to think about, how people are brought in. These are the sorts of questions. So this comes from my colleagues at Yorktown Family Services. One of the few community-based services that actually takes referrals around right-wing. It terrifies me. They started doing this because people were coming to them saying, I've tried every other family youth service in Toronto. No one will talk to my son. No one will deal with my son who's going down this track. Just awful. So they started developing programming and talking to the kids. This is what they're hearing. These are the sorts of, again, very mundane questions, very simple questions. They're asking to start those conversations and bring them down the path, darker and darker path as they go along. So it's as simple as that, right? It is a process of grooming, right? Very, banal questions. And taking them deeper and deeper, depending on what the grievance is, taking them in a different direction. They're very candid. I learned a lot of this too from the coordinator for our center, is actually a former himself, who does an awful lot of work in the community now. Works with social media companies, countering hate, trying to help them develop standards and policies, works with people who are in the movement, trying to pull them out as well. So, and he was a recruiter for a skinhead group, a neo-Nazi skinhead group in the 90s, late 90s, early teens. Okay, so building community resiliency. So these first ones, these are really things to think about yourself. I won't go through all of them. I think you can get a sense of maybe what we're getting at here. Joining forces, creating allyships, creating partnerships, whether informal or formal, supporting the victims in whatever way, as an individual as well as an organization, right? Just reaching out to people or communities that have been targeted. Staying engaged, so it's not just connecting with those communities when something's happened, but staying connected to frequently targeted communities on an ongoing basis. Teaching acceptance, that can be role modeling, that can be having the hard conversations with peers, with your kids, with your siblings, whatever the case may be. Digging deeper, educating yourself, learning yourself. First, digging deeper, learning about your own biases and limits, if you will, but also educating yourself, as you are doing here, right, about the nature, about the nature of the problem, for example. So lots of things that you can do individually. I think this one is really important. Keeping pressure up on your leaders and people who are responsible for taking the lead around hate crime, whether that is politicians or whether it's law enforcement. Ensuring that they are on top of these issues. One of the other things is just to recognize that we're not the US. We are not free speech absolutists, right? According to our Constitution, and this is something the folks at the Freedom Convoy forgot, is that there are legitimate restrictions on our freedoms of speech in the interest of a free and democratic society. And the courts have defined for us in subsequent decisions what hatred is, what crosses that line between hate speech and free speech. So we see here, this is one of the most famous decisions from 1990. Hatred is predicated on destruction, and hatred against identifiable groups therefore thrives on insensitivity, bigotry, and destruction of both the target group and the values of our society. The most extreme emotion that belies reason, if exercised against members of a group, implies that those individuals are to be despised, scorned, denied respect, and made subject to ill treatment on the basis of group affiliation. So it's not just offensive speech. It's not just speech that hurts people's feelings. It's dangerous speech. It's damaging speech. And a really important, this is now a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision, distilled those definitions from subsequent court decisions to identify the 11 hallmarks of hate. So these are the things that distinguish hate speech from free speech, right? So it's language that has these sorts of characteristics. Targeted group is dehumanized, blamed for current problems in society and the world, portrayed as dangerous or violent. Nothing but the banishment, segregation, or eradication of this group will save others from the harm being done. And often calls to take violent action against the targeted group, right? So we do have sort of standards. We do have a category that we can identify as hate speech, because it has consequences, right? It is dangerous, it is damaging, because it does have consequences for others acting on that, and therefore consequences for the targeted communities. What can we do at the community level? Formal anti-hate strategy, at the very least, a formal anti-racism or EDI strategy within municipalities. And more are moving that direction. A couple of colleagues and I, for example, built Oshawa's, sorry to say, first ever EDI strategic plan, I think 5 years ago. And you got to prioritize the resources to support, excuse me, to support it. That's the important thing, right? It has to be staffed. It has to have resources so that it can do training, it can do education, it can do events, it can do the hard work. One place to look is at the Inclusive Municipalities website. This is an international coalition of municipalities united against racism, discrimination, prejudice, and hate. And they have a whole array of resources for how to build these kinds of strategies, not just a strategic plan, but other kinds of initiatives and programs that you can engage in. That's a really good starting point. Coming back to that notion of pressuring the leaders, I think that once we've got all of this in place, that there needs to be transparency in what communities are doing, what municipalities are doing in this space. There needs to be a report card. In terms of policing, when if you've got a hate crime unit, one of the things that I encourage and some of my colleagues in policing do as well is a public annual report on hate crime that shows not just the number reported, but what's the disposition. How many charges were laid? What was the proportion in which charges were laid? That sort of thing. What was the disposition? Has it made its way through the court? What has been the decision there? And that's, I think, a really valuable tool for the community. Public condemnation, so again, demanding of your leaders that they condemn these things when they see them. I remember very early on in COVID, this is such a small example but so powerful. The mayor of Markham, which is arguably has one of the highest concentrations of Asian people, Chinese people specifically. Very early on, when there was no lockdown, went to a restaurant, and I think it was actually called the Hunan restaurant. And a Chinese restaurant for lunch. Of course, took the media with them, and this was a media opportunity for him. But he said, come on down, having a great lunch. I'm having a good time. Don't be afraid. Come on down to the community. That was so powerful for a leader to say, there's nothing to be afraid of, right? And to be in solidarity with the community. It was in part of a photo op, but I think it really did have an impactful message. Funding for anti-hate events, of course, that's part of the resources for the anti-hate strategy. Engage the media, that example was one of those. Multi-sectoral hate crime committees, Alberta, for example, this is at the provincial level rather than at the local level, has a committee that draws on law enforcement, on the Crown's office, education, public services, a whole array of community-based organizations as well, to develop strategies and programs around hate crime, to provide training for community-based organizations, for other police services, for example. So really, I think any response to hate crime needs to be multi-sectoral. It's not just a law enforcement issue, it's not just a criminal justice issue, it is a public health issue, it is an educational issue, it is a social services issue, it is a welfare issue, all of those pieces So all of those pieces need to be involved. Engaging in anti-hate training within the municipality and within the workplace, right? Some of these rules or some of these suggestions apply to workplaces as well. The development of counter narratives, especially given the disinformation that we're seeing so much of. Create an information and resource repository. An online space where resources for how to counter hate are available, right? For community-based organizations and individuals. Awareness opportunities, conversations about hate in the community. And if you do a local newsletter, does the anti-racism group have a regular newsletter?
Not amongst ourselves within the committee, but we do report to, online, we let them know what we're doing.
Okay, yeah.
We're relatively new, this is all new ground for us.
Yeah, well, there you go, there's one thing you can know.
Yeah, definitely taking notes.
And acknowledge and recognize successful practices, and this is about rewarding those who are doing the hard work and the good work in the community, so that it fosters copycats. It fosters others who will do similarly good work because there's incentive, right? There's recognition, and that doesn't have to cost anything. It could just be a public statement. These folks done good, right? Here's the certificate. And I think that's it's a small gesture, but very, very important. And I think that's it for me. Yes, it is. Great. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate that.